Consider the horse, Equus caballus, revered by man, dominated for centuries. The essence of beauty in motion. In great urban habitats, man still makes use of the horse. This is the 20th century horse, born, bred, and trained to serve humankind. Yet in its silent genes, it carries a wild song, a memory of self-rule, a will to run free and live free. In a land far from civilization, there is another kind of horse, one which knows no human master, a horse that is part of our heritage, a symbol of the last western frontier, the wild horse of the Nevada desert. Nevada, a land of awesome beauty, rugged mountains, harsh deserts, and vast stretches of publicly owned land. To many, these wide open spaces appear to be a wasteland, devoid of trees and water, a land through which one travels to go somewhere else. But here, on some 87,000 square miles of sage desert rangeland, scattered herds of wild horses live and breed. For at least 100 years, horses have fed on the sparse vegetation and watered at even scarcer springs. Early settlers named these places like Wild Horse Canyon, Mustang Spring, Dead Stallion Gulch. The mountains and flats of Nevada are home, in fact, to some 60% of all wild horses in America. They are called mustangs by some, feral animals by others, and by some, a nuisance. Unlike their domestic counterparts, these horses have reverted to a primitive social order, an order in which nature, not man, determines which horses will live and which will die. Every wild horse in this herd or local population has a place in that social order. A herd is made up of a number of individual bands, and each band consists of a single dominant stallion. He gathers all the mares he can defend, together with their young. Each band occupies its own place of ground, or home range, within the overall area being used by a herd. It is the behavior of the stallions in a herd that powers the social order. Each one resists encroachment by any bordering stallion and drives away all challengers who show interest in his harem. At the same time, he restrains his mares to prevent them from straying off his home range. This social order guarantees that the strongest males will be the breeders. But surplus males, those unable to win battles for females, have their place in the herd too. Until a male is 2 or 3 years old, he is allowed to remain with his mother in his birth band. When he begins to mature, however, his father will drive him out. By nature social, these young outcasts seek each other's company and form bachelor bands. For several years they run together. They engage in mock battles and practice hurting one another in preparation for the day they will win and defend harems of their own. Wild mares appear to be entirely subordinate, but they too perform important social functions. It is the lead mare in each band who chooses the escape route the harem will take. Meanwhile, the stallion remains behind to face whatever threat has spooked them. The mares also groom one another. It is likely the strong attachments they form by doing this is a kind of social glue that helps hold the band together. Though a mare will leave her harem sisters to bear a foal, she will return of her own volition when her baby is strong enough to keep up with the others. The horse's speed and endurance is its natural defense against predators. Just hours after birth, a newborn foal must be ready to run with its mother to safety. Where did these wild horses come from? And how did they happen to go wild? All horses in America, wild and otherwise, are descended from domestic stock brought to American shores by Europeans. Yet, paradoxically, North America spawned the horse. 60 million years ago, a tiny, pock-sized creature lived in what is now called the Great Basin. Over epochs of time, this animal changed. It grew larger and lost all but its big toes. Only 11,000 years ago, the eyes of this prehistoric Nevada stallion once viewed the same land. Its enlarged bones tell of powerful muscles that once propelled this animal through high snow or mud. But strength alone wasn't enough for survival. Something happened. About 7,000 years ago, this native species disappeared. It's a puzzle to this day. Fortunately, it did not die out before many waves of its kind had crossed the land bridge that long connected Alaska and Siberia. Gradually, the horse was shaped by work and man's will into various breeds. In the deserts of North Africa, one strain bred for service was especially tough. It was this strain that first traveled back to America with the help of man. Early Spanish explorers reintroduced these horses to the North American continent. When Americans settled the Great Basin states, hardly more than a century ago, they found wild horses had beat them to it. For at least 100 years, mustangs had been enjoying freedom in the land of their origins. It happened because of the American Indian. As early as 1650, southwestern tribes helped themselves to horses from early Spanish settlements along the Rio Grande. A passion for owning horses quickly spread northward from tribe to tribe. Though often small and not always beautiful, the ponies that surrounded their camps had heart. Unflinchingly, they bore riders into herds of stampeding buffalo. Without hesitation, they penetrated U.S. cavalry lines. This was the kind of horse the first settlers to the Great Basin Desert found running wild. And they were theirs for the taking. The smartest mustangs escaped being noosed and grew even wilder. In time, these were joined by new recruits, horses brought west by the settlers and cowboys, horses which, like the mustangs, carried a wild song in their genes. Early settlers in Nevada claimed almost all of the scarce natural springs, often fencing and improving them for livestock use, and to prevent use by competing wild horses. Pipes or troughs were installed to prevent animals from trampling and destroying them. By late spring, what few creeks exist have run dry. As summer wears on, the horses are forced to water where they can find it. A spring may be their only source of water for a radius of 20 miles. By noon, several thirsty bands begin to work their way closer to the water. Another band eagerly approaches the water hole. The lead mare and the stallion watch now, more than ever, for any signs of danger. Something isn't right, and the band freezes. It could be a mountain lion, or the scent of man. Usually separated by miles, the stallions and their bands begin to compress into tighter and tighter spaces. As they close into the water, that space will shrink to a matter of feet. When more than one band arrives at a waterhole at the same time, the stallions must sort out who drinks first. The risk of an aggressive encounter exists. A powerful kick can stove in a rib cage, break a leg, or crush a skull. Stallions are ever more vigilant in herding mares to themselves, lest they stray into a rival's harem. The day's fighting over, the two stallions return to their home ranges. Though the next day may bring further challenges, the stallions' true adversaries are not other stallions. The wild horses of Nevada are caught in a fight they're not capable of comprehending. To the wild horse, it's a fight for survival with the machines of man. To man, it's a fight between two groups of people with fundamentally different philosophies. The fight is over which animals and how many of each man will allow to live on the public rangelands. It boils down to available grass, the desert commodity in shortest supply. Paying a small fee for each cow or sheep they are permitted to graze on public lands, ranchers want fewer wild horses. One livestock operator is Joe Fellini, a third-generation Nevada rancher and user of the public lands.
Well, where you run into most of your damage with horses is in the summertime when the water is real short. They'll come into a spring like this particular one here, Milk Spring. There won't be enough water available for them to drink it, so they'll stick around and they'll drink it dry, and then that's when you get into trouble. Well, the livestock, the domestic livestock, are held the same. And when the horses are not managed by the Bureau of Land Management, what happens is the numbers increase, and as they increase, well, then there's an extra demand for forage and extra demand for water. And whenever you meet any one of these criteria and overuse it, well, then you're starting to do destruction to the livestock industry.
conflict between cattle and sheep ranchers and wild horses dates back 100 or more years. By the beginning of the 20th century, cattle and sheep numbers had become too high for the range to handle. Radical damage was done to much of Nevada's desert vegetation. Wild horses were made a scapegoat for these conditions, and thousands were captured or shot. Since they were classified as neither wildlife or domestic livestock, no law protected them from abuse and exploitation. Using airplanes and trucks to harass and drive these wild bands from their remote sanctuaries, profiteers called mustangers gathered and sold the wild horses to canneries. Ungoverned by law and unmoved by compassion, these men gave little thought to the injuries they caused, to the foals they left behind to starve, to the mares that aborted during the brutal chases. Something had to be done to save Nevada's wild horses from extinction. It happened in 1970, when Joan Blue of the American Horse Protection Association, Hope Wrighton, and Wild Horse Annie of Reno, Nevada, spearheaded a movement for federal legislation to grant the wild horses freedom to run wild on public lands. A concerned public, including thousands of letter-writing school children, pressed Congress to pass legislation declaring the wild horse a national heritage species and an integral part of our public lands ecosystems. The horses were placed under the authority of the Bureau of Land Management, or BLM for short. The Congressional Act stopped the slaughter, but it created a new era in which the BLM's management of the wild horse on public lands has been criticized both by ranchers and by wild horse advocates. John Boyles is BLM Director of Wild Horse Affairs.
The livestock operator has historically made a living for his family off the public lands by grazing his cattle. At a more national level, I think the wild horse and burro groups, the advocacy groups, are more interested in seeing the overall number of animals maintained than the number of herds maintained. What the Bureau tries to do is to strike a balance in there so that we can accommodate the livestock operator as well as the wild horse and burro and balance those numbers against the available forage.
With much of Nevada's rangelands in poor condition, both ranchers and wild horse advocates agree that public lands need upgrading. What they don't agree on is who or what is causing the deterioration. Nevada cattleman Matt Benson blames wild horses for the damage.
Well, I've been involved in the cattle business in Nevada for over 30 years. And the wild horse problem was not so great 30 years ago as it is today. With the passage of the Wild Horse and Burro Act, of course, the horses started to multiply in numbers, and the Bureau of Land Management, in charge of managing these horses, did not carry out the mandate of the law. And so the numbers have increased. And with the increase in their numbers, they have decimated the range in many places. I have a friend who had a ranch in Jersey Valley who had to completely get rid of his ranch. He's now out in Elko County and had to abandon his ranch in Jersey Valley because of too many wild horses. There were more serious problems in the southern part of the state where Joe Fellini had been.
But Rose Strickland, who heads the Range Conservation Committee for the Nevada chapter of the Sierra Club, has a different opinion.
When you try to look at the question of how much damage a wild horse may cause, basically we're talking about 25,000 horses, and we're talking about 200,000 or 300,000 cattle. The numbers would indicate that the horses are not going to be a very large component of overgrazing on the public lands. In Nevada, for instance, wild horses only live in 30% of the state. You know, how do the anti-horse people explain the overgrazing that's occurring in the other 70% of the state? Horses, I feel, are being made to be a scapegoat for a lot of the damage of the public land that's both historical and is ongoing.
Every year, BLM roundups capture thousands of wild horses from Nevada's public rangelands. As a result, its holding corrals are full of horses. Many people ask why so many horses have to be removed. One of them is Hope Ryden, author of the book America's Last Wild Horses.
When they round them up at this rate, they can't possibly get them adopted. You see so many horses, you think there must be a lot of horses out there. Well, there aren't. There aren't a lot of horses out there. There are a lot of horses in the pens. And when one sees them in a holding pen, dispirited, no longer the wild horse that races across the desert, no longer the stallion that protects his mares, it's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy of mismanagement.
At the present time, how do we dispose of the excess animals, particularly those that are not adopted, has become an issue. The law would require that we destroy those animals. Unfortunately, this is not possible under present political climate.
Since most of the wild horses live in remote mountain sanctuaries, they are out of sight of the general public. The result is that most pressure for public land use has come mainly from local livestock operators.
If people had their druthers, I think they would want more wildlife and more wild horses and less livestock. But the way the system is set up right now, there's almost no way for people to express their demands through the land use planning process or any other way to the Bureau of Land Management or the other land management agencies.
In the meantime, herds of wild horses in Nevada's Great Basin continue to decline. In total, they number about 50,000 throughout the United States. Some fear the population will drop too low. Biologist Craig Downer has spent many years observing wild horses.
It is not a large number because it's very sparsely distributed over its environment, and particularly in light of the combative forces which could easily annihilate it, of civilization. It is a rather weak number. I see that when man cuts them down to too low a level, severe problems can arise with inbreeding.
Dawn Lappin is director of WOA, an acronym for Wild Horse Organized Assistance.
The rangelands are extremely fragile and a disappearing thing in most cases. There's not very much left out there to preserve for our children. I think it's something that we need to look at now so that we can define for the future what our children will see in centuries to come.
These controversies raise several environmental questions. Which interests should control our public lands? How many and what kinds of animals should live on them? To what extent should humans attempt to control nature? As one species on Earth, we humans see the wild horse and try to evaluate it on human terms. It is not a productive animal in an economic sense, nor is it under man's control. Yet our reaction to the horse's easy transition to its wild state may tell us more about ourselves than we think.
Indeed, I think we have a lesson to learn from the wild horse. Can we, or is it too late, can we go back? Can we return to living in a sane and balanced world rather than having to rigidly control everything? Let us learn to appreciate what's here and what has been here for millions of years and has supported life. This is a crucially important point, and I think life's freedom is, as demonstrated by the wild horse, is entirely tied up with this philosophical point.
I suspect that its freedom is what I thrill to when I see a band of wild horses race across a desert. Their uncut manes flying, their tails flying. I wonder if it's because the horse has so long been cast in the role of man's servant that the free horse appeared so beautiful to me. I suspect it's because the horse gone wild, by his existence, proves that lost freedom can be recovered. And that's why so many people respond to this animal with such overwhelming support. So many letter writers wrote to me and said that they knew they would never see a wild horse, yet they wanted to know that wild horses still exist in America.
They are part of American heritage. They represent the spirit of the American people. They're part of the West. And I believe that if we lose part of them, we lose part of ourselves.
There are immense and intangible values lying in these unfenced, untrammeled open spaces left in America. The wild horses are at the center of the controversy over who will control these spaces. Settling these issues forces us to re-examine our values and decide once again what is important to us. Have economic factors now become paramount? Or can we still make room for an animal whose worth cannot be measured in dollars and cents? For what the wild horse means to Americans is purely mythic. It symbolizes our past. It lends beauty to our present. And it confirms our belief in a future in which freedom will prevail.